We are now at 7:29, and I am happy to be able to introduce Vince Aloyo, who's going to talk to us about overwintering. And I imagine everybody on this Zoom knows exactly who Vince is. We get this amazing response to the mailing. All these people were like, oh my goodness, it's going to be Vince. But for those of you who don't, he's a master beekeeper from Eastern Apicultural Society, and he's studied with amazing people like at Cornell and University of Guelph and Marla Spivak. He's been a bee inspector. He's on the Pennsylvania Advisory Board. I don't need to tell you guys how great he is, but I did want to tell one story. Is that I was so excited calling him up to schedule him for this, that we talked about all this stuff he could talk about. And I ended up going into our newsletter and saying, he could talk about this, he could talk about this. And he calls me up and said, well, which one do you want me to talk about? Yeah. And I said, well, whatever you like. Well, say I could talk about it for an hour about any one of these things. And I'm like, oh, yeah. So we had to narrow it down. And we thought overwintering would be good. But I am really happy to say he's the most gracious and generous person about doing this and talking to us about, how to go into overwintering at this point in the year, and what we can do to be ready to help our bees in the best way. So here, thank you, Vince. And we'll.
Okay, thank you, Chris. I never get this right. Just a second. I thought I was all set, but I'm not all set. Okay. Okay, so you see my slides?
Yep.
Okay, so yeah, we did have, I had another whole talk prepared when I realized that the newsletter said something different. So I quick changed things around. Not a big problem. We have a lot of knowledgeable people on tonight. So I welcome comments as well as questions or corrections. Bear in mind that we have a limited amount of time, so I had to slice this lecture down to try to make it fit our time constraints. So I want to discuss my thoughts about how you should be preparing your colony for the coming winter. I know it's hot as hell, but we have to start thinking now about winter. And of course, our bees have been thinking about winter since last spring. And that's their goal, always getting ready for the coming winter. So most of us want to produce honey. I don't think any of us do any major pollination. And so we're looking for honey for next year. And so there are several things that influence honey production for next year. We have to be lucky with the weather. We have to have a lot of nectar producing plants within the flight range of our bees. And we have to have strong colonies at the time of the major nectar flow. And of these three things, the one thing that we can and must control is the strength of our colony at the time of the honey flow next spring. So to get that strong colony next spring, early summer, we have to have the colony survive the winter. So to get them to survive the winter, we have to start the management process now. And the key point to remember, you already all know, your beekeepers, is that honeybees don't hibernate. So they need a food supply to get them through the time when there are no flowers available. Okay. This is from Kim Flotham. I said this at one of the beekeepers meetings some years ago, that we should take care of the bees that will take care of the bees that will survive the winter. And so that's what we're really talking about. So Langstroth already told us back in the 1860s or so the requirements for overwintering colonies. Now, Langstroth, of course, didn't have Varroa mites to contend with, but the basic principles are still the same. Langstroth recommended that we should have a large population of young, healthy bees that are going to be ready for winter at around the end of October, of course, depending upon the particular year. Fall can come later or earlier. As we talked about a few minutes ago with the mite-a-thon, you should be checking your mite levels now. You should be monitoring them monthly, and you should be treating if your mite levels get high enough to justify treating. So throughout this lecture, I won't mention it again, you're going to keep your mite levels low so that your bees can have a better chance to make it through the winter. Why won't this thing work? Okay. So if we want the young population of young bees, only way we're going to get that is if our queen is laying a lot of eggs. And if there's a dearth in your particular area, I think there is in mine right now, there's not many resources for the bees to collect. And so we may need to supplement the bees, not for winter stores, but to keep the queen laying eggs. So you may need to feed them light syrup, the 1-to-1 sugar syrup, to replace the nectar that's not available. And we may need to give them high quality protein if there's no pollen. And one of the things you have to think about, and I'll talk about this in some detail now, is that a lot of times you will see talk about crude protein or total protein. Crude protein or total protein doesn't tell the whole story. It's nice to have protein, but if the protein is not what I call balanced, it's not going to be that usable for the bees. This is not something new. De Groot told us this back in 1953, so almost 70 years ago. He said that the amount of pollen available to a bee colony is a limiting factor in apiculture. And this is because pollen is the major source of some key nutrients, some proteins, fats, vitamins, and minerals. And when I first started beekeeping a long time ago, we didn't really worry that much about pollen because there were a lot of weeds out there. But with the development of better herbicides, the weeds that feed bees are being sprayed and killed off. And so now we have to think about pollen for our bees. You know, it's very easy with herbicides for people to have these beautiful, in quotes, lawns where there is nothing but green grass. And that is not helpful for any of the pollinators, including our bees. So this is from the Kreilsheim in Austria, has done a lot of research on honeybee nutrition, and it's a feedback system. So we know that there are individual bees in the colony, but the colony as a whole, the superorganism, is very important. So we can think about nutrition at several levels. We can think about nutrition at the colony level, how much protein, how much pollen has the colony harvested from the flowers. And of course, that colony level nutrition is going to influence the adult level nutrition. And the value of the pollen is going to influence the value of the nutritional status of the adult bees. And then in addition, those adult bees, of course, are in charge of feeding the larva. And so if the adult bees have good nutrition available, they'll be able to feed the larva with good nutrition, and those larvae will develop into healthy bees. However, if pollen is limiting, then they'll limit the number of larvae that they support, and they'll limit the amount of food that they give to the queen to downregulate her egg laying. And in extreme conditions, the bees will actually consume eggs and young larvae, recycle that protein to feed to the older larvae so that they have some adult bees. This is a survival strategy, but of course it sets the colony back. And larvae that are raised under less than ideal nutrition will become less than fully functional adult bees. So we follow line E here. And of course, if the adult bees are suffering from lack of nutrition when they were larvae, that's going to also influence their ability to collect pollen. So the pollen colony level nutrition suffers as well. So when should you feed supplemental protein to your bees? And you want to consider feeding supplemental protein in times when there's either not much pollen available or there is only a single source of pollen available. And right now, at least in my area, there is little pollen available. So we should think about feeding supplemental pollen. Now, the research has been done by Otis and co-workers in Canada, shows that supplemental protein feeding extends brood rearing, but does not really facilitate overwintering of the fall reared bees. And that's critical, fall reared bees, because we want to get ready for the fall reared bees. And to do that, we need a good population of bees, as we already mentioned. So the nutritional value of pollens has not been studied as extensively as I would like, because there are, as you know, hundreds, thousands of flowers, and only a few have really been studied to take a look at the value to honeybees. So some that have been studied, blackberry, cottonwood, rapeseed, chestnut, they have been shown to be very good sources of protein for honeybees. However, you'll notice that those are all spring blooming plants. And one study looked at dandelion. Dandelion was an okay source. There's not much dandelions blooming right now. And then some of the things that are blooming right now include ragweed, corn, and maybe some of the grasses. And these are all very poor sources of protein for our bees. I looked extensively to see if I could find if someone has studied the nutritional value of goldenrod. I wasn't able to find anything except that increasing CO2 reduces the amount of protein in the pollen of goldenrod, but nothing about how good that pollen is for honeybees. And the other thing which probably makes this type of study difficult is there are probably 100 species of goldenrod. And as you probably are aware, the goldenrod that blooms in our area is not a major source of honey flow most years. In other parts of Pennsylvania, goldenrod becomes a major source of honey. So the Grote told us about the amino acid balance. So proteins are made up of amino acids. So when we or a bee eats a protein, we digest it, we get out the amino acids, we absorb them, and we put them back together to make the proteins that we need. And that works for us, and it works for our bees. And the consensus is that for honeybees, the best nutrition comes when bees have a mixture of pollens from different plants to harvest at any one time. And there have been a variety of studies that show that whether they're cage studies or other things, that these polyfloral mixed protein diets are the best for the bees. And in fact, there was a study showing that the polyfloral diet was able to upregulate the immune functions of honeybees. I originally put down beware of a pollen dearth. And then I got thinking about that, and that's not right. What we have to be thinking about is a protein dearth. So if you look in your colonies right now, you may find that they have several frames of pollen. And so you may come to the conclusion, oh, they've got lots of pollen available, so I don't need to feed them any supplemental protein. But the question you have to ask yourself, you should be asking yourself, is that pollen usable protein? And when there is a lack of pollen, whether that's in the spring, summer, or fall, the bees will collect useless dust. And for example, I was surprised, one of my slides disappeared. Anyway, I was surprised last July, a beekeeper sent me this photo of her bees digging around in the cracked corn, and they're picking up the shards of cracked corn to take back to their hive. And of course, it's doubtful that the fragments of cracked corn have any nutritional value for honeybees, but they're doing the best they can. Oh, there's my picture. Anyway, cracked corn. So what you have to know, and it's important for beekeeping, is that the bees that actually go to the field and collect the pollen, they are not the ones that eat the pollen or digest the pollen. They bring it back, they put it in the cell, and the nurse bees, those younger 10 to 2-week-old bees, are the ones that can digest the pollen. So some people have called the nurse bees the stomach of the colony, since they are the only ones that have the enzymes that can digest the pollen. And so they eat the pollen that the foragers have collected. They digest it, and then their hypopharyngeal and their mandibular glands then produce usable food. And the nurse bees not only feed the larva, but they feed everybody for protein. They feed the larva, the queen, drones, and other workers. um, research has shown that when a forager comes, a pollen forager comes back from the field, um, she's hungry. And so she asked the nurse bees for some food. If the nurse bees give her food that is rich in protein, the forager knows, okay, there's no real need to collect more pollen. We have a lot of it. But if the nurse bee is stingy with the protein and the food that she gives the forager, that's a signal to the forager to get out there and collect more pollen if there is pollen available. Okay. I mentioned before, lack of good protein. The nurse bees will try to rescue the colony by cannibalizing the eggs and the very young larvae, digesting that protein and feeding it to the older larvae. They'll give the queen less food, resulting in fewer eggs being laid. And this results in a lack of buildup of the colony population at the time when we're trying to raise bees for getting ready for winter. Okay. So if you have a question about, is the protein that your bees have, is it good protein? How can you tell? And most of us are not chemists. We don't have the ability to do chemical analysis, but we don't need to. We just have to ask our bees. And we ask two ways. We look at the larva and we look at the pollen. So this is from Randy Oliver. I'm trying to take my own picture of this, but my little device that I bought, I haven't quite mastered it yet to take a good picture. The light is too bright and it washes everything out. But in this picture from Randy, you see that the larvae are swimming in large pools of royal jelly. This is what I like to see when I do grafting for queen cells. In fact, I usually feed the queen mother colony pollen substitute, whether there's protein coming in or not, to make sure that the nurse bees have sufficient protein so that the larvae are swimming in the royal jelly. It makes it much easier to pick that larva up and transfer it to a queen cup. And this is also from Randy, where the larvae are being fed less food, so there's less royal jelly or brood food available to them. And so these larvae are going to be protein stressed. And it's been shown that the adult bees that were raised under protein stress, not enough protein, they are poor foragers. And in fact, one paper, I'm trying to follow this up, but one paper said that these were so poor foragers that they would die after a single day of foraging. And that was from Madela's work in 2015. So I sent her an email and asked her to elaborate that. I haven't heard back from her yet.
Wow.
And the other thing to look at is the pollen. So we said that your colonies may have frames of pollen stored in the hive right now. And so you want to look at that pollen. So in this picture, you can see that all the pollen is that same sort of off yellow color. And this probably means that this pollen all came from a single type of flower. And we said earlier that a mixture of pollens from different flowers supplied the best nutrition. So having pollen from only a single flower, could be corn, for example. If there's corn growing in your in the vicinity of your hives. So it may be that they have lots of pollen, but not nutritious pollen. But if we look at a frame like this, we see pollens of several different colors. We have the yellow, we have red, we have sort of green and some other off colors. So this would indicate that the bees are have several sources of flowers available to collect pollen. And as we said earlier, the polyfloral pollen supplies the best nutrition. And the other thing that you have to remember is that unlike honey, bees are gluttons when it comes to honey. They'll collect as much as they possibly can, much more than they need for the winter. I mean, we take advantage of that by harvesting that surplus honey. They only collect a small amount of pollen at any one time. And there have been some very nice experiments showing that if you go into a colony and take out frames full of pollen, that will stimulate pollen collection. If, in contrast, you go into a colony and put in frames of pollen, that will slow down pollen collection. So pollen stores are determined by the amount they already have, by the availability of pollen in the environment, and by genetics. So Page and co-workers showed that there is a strong genetic component to how much pollen a colony will collect. But the thing to remember is that they have a lot of pollen today. They will probably have consumed all that pollen by next week. So it's a continuing process of collecting additional pollen and nurse bees consuming it and feeding it to the larva. Okay, so if your bees need pollen or need protein, so there are a variety of pollen substitutes commercially available, or you can make your own. But the thing to remember is that there is no pollen substitute that can completely replace natural pollen. And the advantage of the commercially available pollen substitutes, or the ones you make yourself, is that they can supplement whatever natural pollen is coming into the hive, but they can't replace all of the pollen. If you're going to feed pollen substitute as a patty, whether one you mix yourself or buy a commercial patty, you have to remember how bees store their pollen. So they store their pollen adjacent to the brood area. So when you put a pollen patty into your colony, you need to put this very close to the brood, because that's where the nurse bees are looking for it. And if you have brood in two boxes, putting it between the two boxes is a very good idea. The other thing that we have to remember, in our area, we have a lot of small hive beetles, especially there seem to be increasing in number this time of year. The small hive beetles love pollen patties, pollen substitute patties. So you can't put a pound or two of pollen substitute in there and think, okay, the bees are going to be good for quite some time now. If you do, you'll just be feeding small hive beetle larvae. So you want to put in small amounts at frequent intervals to reduce the small hive beetles feeding on it. And the one thing we do know is that the pollen substitute patty, the bees don't store it. They consume it and use it So it's not like natural pollen that they can store. This time of year, I haven't started yet, but I think I will soon. You can do open feeding of pollen substitute. So this is a little experiment I did some years ago now. I happen to have Ultra B and Mega B powder available. And I put out 2 containers of dry pollen substitute powder, one of Ultra B and one of Mega B. And the bees show a very clear preference for the dry powder Ultra B. They will pack it in their pollen baskets and take it home. And some years ago, Randy Oliver started an experiment to see if they actually utilize the stored pollen substitute powder. And I asked him recently if he had ever finished that experiment, and he said he had not. And he was trying to encourage us to do it. But I don't think I have enough colonies to really do that kind of study. Okay, I was at that. Okay, any questions so far about that? I did want to say one more thing. Randy Oliver has done some new, so some years ago, he studied a bunch of commercially available and homemade pollen substitutes to see which were the best, and Ultra B and Mega B were among the best that he had. But since that time, there's been some new pollen substitutes, one containing the seaweed spirulina, and the other one, I think it's AP23 or something like that. So Randy has undertaken a new study of pollen substitutes, and he mentioned that I think at the Chester County meeting earlier this year, and he's been publishing in the ABJ. He's been teasing us so far. So I think it was in July, he told us all about his experimental design. And in August, he told us some more information. I'm hoping in September, he will tell us the conclusion, but he hasn't done that yet. Okay, so besides protein, what else do we have to consider when we're trying to get our bees ready for winter? And one of the things we have to think about is queen health. So how is the queen doing? Is she laying sufficient eggs? Does she have sufficient sperm? And one of the things that we have to think about, there's been very good experiments, McAfee, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that name right, showed that exposure of the queen to a mated queen to either excessive heat or cold doesn't necessarily kill off the queen, but what it does do is damage the sperm stored in her spermatheca. And so that can reduce the length of time in which she can lay fertilized eggs, or it can make her lay a mixture of worker and drone brood, because if when the egg passes by the opening to the spermatheca, if she releases some sperm, but those happen to be dead sperm, then the egg is not going to be fertilized. She thinks she's laying a fertilized egg, but it's not. And so it can turn into, or will turn into drone brood. And then we were talking earlier about laying workers when the colony is long-term queenless. Okay. So if you pull up a frame like this from your hive, you're going to declare this an excellent queen. There's brood from top to bottom, left to right. And the other thing is that there are very few empty cells indicating that this queen didn't mate with genetically similar drones. On the other hand, if you pull up a frame and you see a pattern like this spotty brood pattern, this indicates there's some kind of problem. We don't know just from looking at one frame what that problem might be. So we have to investigate that. So if it's a relatively new queen, this could result from inbreeding. If a queen mates with related drones, some of those what should have been workers because they got fertilized will turn into what are called diploid drones. And the nurse bees can detect these diploid drones and they're going to cannibalize them. So that could be a problem. It could be disease, for example, like European foul brood, where the workers are actively removing disease larvae and therefore there's a spotty brood pattern. It could be that your bees have a lot of the Varroa sensitive hygiene genetics and the workers are removing Varroa infested brood. Or, as we just talked about, this could be the result of a pollen dearth and the nurse bees are eating the eggs and the young larvae that the queen has laid. So you need to go in there, decide which of any, if any of these problems is the cause of the poor brood pattern and then work to correct it. We talked about drone brood in worker comb. So if we look here, you can see that these cells are distorted. That's because these are drone pupae and the bees are distorting the cells because the drones, as you know, need more room to develop. So what could be the problem? And so the observation is drone pupa in worker comb. So what could be the problem? One, it could indicate that you have a queen that either has no sperm, didn't mate sufficiently, or the sperm was killed out due to overheating or something like that. And this is a relatively easy problem to fix because there is a queen in there. You go through, you find the queen, you pinch her head, and you put a new queen, and the problem can be corrected. On the other hand, this could indicate that you have laying workers. And the thing with laying workers is, as the name implies, workers, S, there's not just one worker that is laying eggs. There are many, and you can't identify them without killing them and doing a dissection, look at their ovaries. And so there's no way to remove them from the colony. There's some people talk about shaking the bees out away from the hive and the laying workers won't fly back. I don't think that that is true. The best thing right now I would suggest to do is that you newspaper this colony into a colony with a robust queen, and at some time in the future, you can split this colony back out if you want to keep their colony numbers. It is also possible, it sometimes works, that you can take a couple of frames of open brood, eggs and young larvae, and put it into this colony, and the pheromones coming from the brood will suppress the laying workers' ovaries. And then, I haven't tried this, but I've heard that if you put a queen cell in between those 2 or 3 frames of open brood that when the queen emerges, they will accept her. So I haven't tried it, but that's what I've read, and I think Jim Bob told us that he does that. Okay. And the reason that lack of sperm, whether it comes from the queen that has run out of sperm or from the laying workers, is that because drones are derived from unfertilized eggs. And we just talked about this. Jeff told us at the beginning of the lecture, normally laying workers, you'll see several eggs in one cell. I always consider the hallmark of a laying worker is that the egg is not all the way down in the center of the cell, but Jeff pointed out that he has a, Jeff Eckel that is, that he has a queen right colony where the queen is laying eggs on the side. And I think it was Justin said that he's seen laying workers lay the eggs dead center as like a queen would do. So it's a little bit iffy, but you'll tell soon enough. I don't think you have to wait for the cell to be capped to know it's laying workers, because you'll see the bees start to extend the walls of the cell out a little bit to accommodate the bigger drones. So you can tell that it's a drone, developing drone larva before it's actually capped over. And we talked about this, the mixed worker drone brood can be due to the sperm being killed off in the spermatheca. Late summer requeening, this is getting a little bit late, but it's still time. Requeening now gives you a young queen, and the advantage of a young queen is that she tends to lay more eggs, given sufficient food, of course, tends to lay eggs more later into the year, and a young queen will help reduce the probability of swarming the next year. This is a good time if you're going to buy a queen, because they're readily available, they're probably well mated, and they can actually be cheaper than if you try to get a queen in the early spring. Whoops. If for some reason your queen introduction fails, by the time we get into September, queens will probably not be available. And the other thing you have to think about is if there's a dearth going on in your area, you have to be careful for robbing. Okay, and just quickly, requeening, we can talk about 2 types of requeening. One is using mated queen. You go in, you kill off the old queen, put in your new queen, and leave her in the cage for a few days till she's accepted, and then release her. So this procedure gives no brood break, so it doesn't help you any with Varroa control, but there's plenty of time to do that right now.
Hi, ready?
Yeah, somebody had a question? The other way to requeen is with a queen cell. It's getting late, so if you're thinking about doing it, now is the time. So if you use what I call a ripe queen cell, one that's about to emerge from her cocoon in a couple of days, then you'll start to get eggs in 15 to 20 days. And there's still plenty of time to get 2 rounds of brood. It's getting a little bit late, but you can also still do a walk-away split where you allow the bees to raise their own queen, and you'll have 2 rounds of brood by the middle of October, so it's a little bit chancy right now. Okay. introducing the queen, mated queen. Obviously, you have to go in, find the old queen and destroy her. And Wyatt Magnum published some information a couple of years ago now, where he showed that if you get your queen in something like a Benton 3-hole queen, where there are support bees, support worker bees, and with your queen, that it's best to remove the workers from the queen cage. He showed that especially when there wasn't much nectar coming in, that the workers the workers in the cage could interfere with the acceptance or reduce the probability of acceptance of your new queen. And we already talked about that the only real disadvantage of this is that you have to find your old queen killer. If you're looking for a queen, one of the things that I like to do is take the whole colony off its stand, put a new bottom board and an empty box down, and lets the field bees go back to the original stand and get out of your way so that you can look for the queen. Use a minimal amount of smoke because you don't want to get the queen running around. And you remove the combs one at a time. You look at both sides 2 or 3 times, make sure the queen isn't there. And once you sure that the queen's on that frame, put that queen back in the original stand. One of the things that you should be considering this time of year is that there may be a second queen. If you think the queen is doing poorly, the bees may have come to that conclusion before you. And so they may have already superseded, and you may have a mother-daughter queen in that hive. So I highly recommend that you mark your queens so that if you pull up a frame and you find a queen without a mark, you know that this is a new queen and not the queen that you originally thought you had in that hive. And the other way to do this is to use a nuc. So you can take a few frames of brood, put it into a nuc box, introduce your new queen into that nuc box, feed them syrup, pollen substitute, get that queen accepted, get her laying. And the advantage is that then in 3 or 4 weeks, you can check the brood pattern, see how she's doing. If she's doing well, then you can newspaper that nuc back into the original colony and you've accomplished your requeening. Okay, so we talked about that we're trying to take care of the bees, take care of the bees that will raise the bees that are going to live through the winter. And the bees that are going to live through the winter are called, naturally enough, the winter bees. And these are bees, you know that bees in the summertime don't last very long. They die maybe in 6 weeks or so. But the winter bees are special bees that are going to live from the end of fall, beginning of winter, through till next March. In colder climates, they'll live even longer. And these winter bees have a lot of fat bodies. They have a lot of the egg yolk protein, vitellogenin. And it turns out that winter bees are not only developed in the late fall, but research has shown that they develop whenever pollen supply is low. So right now I'm in a pollen dearth. It could be winter bees developing, but that's not going to help because those winter bees it's way too early for those winter bees to live through till next spring. So this is some of the research, 1954, so a long time already, that winter bees develop whenever the queen is restricted. So a lot of us restrict the queen to get a brood break to facilitate a Varroa treatment. And I hadn't realized until I read this paper recently that when we do that, we're probably inducing winter bees even in the middle of the summer. And more recent studies by Madeline Otis in Canada showed that lack of pollen coming into the colony will also induce these so-called winter bees. So feeding pollen right now is good, maintains the colony population, or at least it doesn't go down as much. But then it's important at a certain point that pollen not come into the colony so that the winter bees can develop. Okay. And this is a picture that everybody shows. On the left is a summer bee here, and these bees are stained for fat bodies. You can see that there's very little fat body in the summer bee. On the right are the winter bees and packed full of the fat bodies. And the fat bodies are very interesting because not only they have storage tissue, but they also act sort of like our liver in that they detoxify things for the bees as well. And don't forget, this is where the Varroa mites are feeding on adult bees. So it's kind of disgusting to think about. I mean, imagine for yourself, you had this organism attached onto you and eating your fat. Now, some of us, of course, we might welcome something coming along and removing a little fat around our waist, but in the case of our bees, it's not a good thing for those bees that are going to try to live through till next spring. Okay, so these winter bees, they are really what we're striving for. Healthy winter bees, because these are the bees that are going to live through till next spring. They can live a very long time, and they will use the nutrients stored in their fat bodies to begin brood rearing towards the end of winter, January or February in our area. And if they don't have sufficient fat bodies, either because of poor nutrition in the fall, or because the Varroa mites were eating the fat bodies out of them, then those winter bees are not going to be available for starting that brood rearing before really fresh pollen starts coming into the colony. Okay, so late winter brood rearing, these are the winter bees using their fat bodies. They're going to feed that brood in January and February because it's well established that our bees, even though winter can be raging in January or February, bees are already increasing brood rearing. Okay. Brood rearing stops when there's a pollen shortage. So in the spring or in the late winter, the winter bees use their fat bodies to kickstart brood rearing, and they should have stored bee bread in the colony that they're going to also use to feed those developing larvae. If, however, the bees run out of fat bodies, run out of stored bee bread, brood rearing can stop and your colony can perish. In this area, I always say that March is the month for starvation. So it all depends on getting everything going now. So already mentioned, keep our mites low because they're going to be consuming the fat bodies on our winter bees. Okay. And right now, August through September, maybe even early October, we're going to feed that 1-to-1 syrup if necessary, pollen substitute if necessary, to maintain brood rearing. Later on in the fall, oh yeah, so skipped ahead of myself. How are we doing on time? Oh, we got plenty of time. Okay, so bees have their own strategies for winter survival. So normally bees live in hollow trees. They nest in a cavity. Our bees are like us. They like to live inside a cavity. They live in a tree or a beehive or the wall of somebody's house. We prefer to live in a house or a tent or a yurt or something like that. The cavity helps keep the rain off them, keep the snow off them, and of course provide some windproofing. Now, normally in the wild, bees like to nest high up in a tree, so that really helps reduce predation because they're out of the way of bears and skunks, reduces the invasion by mice, and of course we already talked about that they gather honey as much as they can fit into their cavity. So this is a piece of log where some bees were nesting, a tree fell down, and one, you can see some of the comb here, but you can see the thickness of this tree branch or trunk here. And I measured it. The thinnest part here was 2.5 inches thick, and contrast that with our beehives, which are only 3/4 of an inch thick. So this particular tree provided much more insulation than our little beehive does. So what some people do, it's in our area, I think it's optional, is to make our beehive more like that tree trunk by wrapping the hive. May provide a little insulation, may provide some extra windbreak. Further north, I think this is routinely done. Here in the Philadelphia area, it's more optional. We don't keep our bees 30 to 40 feet up into the air where the mice are less likely to get into the hive. So then we have to do something to help our bees keep the mice out. And there are a variety of mouse guards that are commercially available, or you can make your own. The idea is just to restrict the mice from going into the hive to nest for the winter. Bees will actually try to reduce the entrance themselves. They'll put propolis to reduce the entrance. Of course, with our hive sitting a few inches off the ground, the mice can easily penetrate that propolis screen. The other thing that beekeepers commonly do is provide upper ventilation. And I've been doing this all the time. I've been keeping bees, but it turns out it's somewhat controversial. I think it was the August ABJ, maybe it was July, I forget. People talking about upper entrance may be a bad thing. I haven't tried overwintering my colonies without an upper entrance, but if somebody's brave enough, they can do a little experiment and tell us next year how it worked out. The one thing that we need to do is to shelter our beehives from the prevailing wind. This is an old picture. I used to keep my bees on a farm that's now all townhouses. But anyway, at that time, I used this mesh, this lattice screening and burlap to reduce the wind chill for the bees. And there's all kinds of things that you can do to make a windbreak for your bees. So we know that the bees don't hibernate, they need a lot of food. And in our area, we usually say that they need 60 to 80 pounds of honey. I prefer to err on the side of 80 pounds because sometimes our winters, like last winter, can be long and cold. So towards the end of the fall, if your colonies do not have sufficient stores, then instead of feeding one-to-one slowly, as you may be doing right now, you want to feed more rapidly. And instead of feeding one-to-one syrup, you can feed 2-to-1 syrup or some of the commercial syrup mixtures, the ProSweet or invert syrup, something like that. So if we look in the bottom left here, this is a Miller feeder developed by the great C.C. Miller. So these are made out of wood, and these slats here are floats, so you can pour a gallon of syrup on 1 gallon on either side of this. The bees climb up through the center and climb up through the center, down onto the float. They prevent drowning. They can syrup up a crop full of syrup and go back down and process it like honey. In the upper left, you see a plastic version of the Miller feeder. Once again, you can hold 2 gallons of syrup. The bees climb up through the center, down the screen, get the syrup and go back down and process it. Or you can use multiple buckets, but the idea for late fall feeding is the rapid feeding so that the bees store it and don't turn it into bees. Right now with the 1-to-1 syrup, you want the bees to, you want to feed it slowly so the bees consume that syrup and turn it into more bees. The other thing that the bees do, not yet, but in maybe a month or so, they will get rid of the drones. So this happens not only in the fall, but whenever life gets tough. So the drones are a luxury item for a bee colony. So in the fall, food resources are starting to get scarce. They will restrict the queen from laying eggs in drone cells. They will stop feeding the drone larvae and cannibalize them. They will stop feeding the adult drones. and they will kick the drones out of the colony, and they won't let them back in. The exception is a colony that feels it has a failing queen will tolerate drones. So if you go into your apiary late in the year, all your colonies have no drones, but one does, that's a sign that they think their queen is failing. And by that late in the season, the only thing really to do is to newspaper that colony into one with a strong queen. Okay. Chris had wanted me to talk a little bit about nukes. We didn't have time to do this, but I overwinter a bunch of nukes, 50 to 60 nukes every year, and I set them up this way. So I use only medium boxes. So I use 3 5-frame medium boxes with the top box packed full of sealed honey, and in the second box from the top, 2 or 3 frames of honey. And then for insurance, I've built a bunch of feeding shims here that I put on the nucleus colony late in the year, just in case I need to feed them some fondant towards spring. I turn the cover not side down. I close off this hole, and I put a piece of styrofoam insulation on top to maintain some warmth. Sometimes I use migratory covers, sometimes telescoping covers. And then I do wrap my nukes, and I've had very good success getting nukes through the winter using this procedure. Now, one thing I want to mention about nukes are that they're small colonies. So treating for Varroa, if you need to treat for Varroa, so I split my colonies several times over the course of the spring and summer. So my Varroa load is usually quite low. But if the Varroa level gets high, then I'm stuck with a dilemma, because you can't use formic acid. If you have brood in there, which you want to put your mites down, as we talked about, get your mite levels down before you're going into winter, so that you have healthy winter bees, then oxalic acid is not the best. I haven't tried Hop Guard. Some people claim the Hop Guard is good for treating Varroa in nukes. And the other thing that can be done is the Apogard, the thymol preparation, but Vita Europe says don't use the full 50 mils of the material, but only use 25 mils, because you will kill some brood. So that's the downside of overwintering nukes. Yeah, somebody?
I have a question, Vince.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, it's kind of a question, and I'll make a plug for you. You sell nukes in the spring. And relating to that, out of your 3 deep 5-frame boxes, how do you get a nuke that you sell from that assembly?
So I wait, during the winter, of course, they're going to eat honey. They move up, and usually by the end of March, assuming the weather is good, I'll have one box that has, I like to sell 3 frames of sealed brood, and of course the corresponding bees. So I usually start feeding pollen substitute about last week or so of February, so that I make sure that brood rearing is going strong. And then by the last week in March, that colony is usually strong enough. So I pull off 3 frames of good sealed brood, some honey in there, and if they're collecting any pollen, a frame with some pollen in it. And then I shake some extra nurse bees in it. And so by the time the colony has that much brood, there's going to be some other brood left. And so I take that other brood that I don't sell and then introduce a mated queen for the next round. So that's what I sell in the spring, is a colony with 3 nice frames of seal. I mean, a box with 3 nice frames of sealed brood, and then some food. And of course, the queen that survived the winter. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to know. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So anyway, our job as beekeepers, we're stewards of the bees. We have to help the bees stay healthy. You can't rely on Jeff. Jeff has too much to do. So you need to study diseases so that you know when it's time to call Jeff and when it's not. You want to make sure that you can identify diseases so you don't spread disease around by combining a weak disease colony with a strong, healthy one. So there's a lot to learn as a beekeeper, and identifying diseases and how to treat them is something that you should study up on. And only when things are really bad, you don't know what's going on, that's the time to call Jeff, because Jeff has so many colonies to try to inspect. He can't get to everybody. Okay, and I think I'm just about done here. The other thing you're going to do, monitor food supply. You're going to look carefully, because when bees are flying on warm days, even if it's in November, they're going to go out and fly. There's probably no flowers. But when they come back, they're going to be hungry. Well, they just went out, they flew a few miles, they came back. Anybody would be hungry. And so even though your colony may have a lot of food at the end of October, if we have a warm November, they may have eaten their winter food because they're going out looking for flowers that aren't there. So one of the things that you have to do is, you can't just say, okay, they've got plenty of food, I don't need to look at them anymore. You've got to check, especially if we have a warm fall, or what happens is we have some few cold weeks and then it warms up again. No flowers, all the flowers have been killed off by that intervening cold spell. The flowers, the bees are out there looking for flowers, there are none, and they come back hungry and they eat up their winter store. So you have to keep in mind that can happen. And that's why I put that feeding rim on my nuke. I prefer not to have to feed them anything, but if they start to get light, then that feeding rim allows me to either put sugar in that thing, to put fondant. And remember that if the temperatures are cold, the bees cannot consume liquid syrup. So you don't feed them sugar syrup in the wintertime. Okay, so our bees are adapted to survive winters much colder than what we have here, but they need our help, especially with regard to Varroa levels, making sure that they have sufficient food, wind shelter, mouse protection, and like I said, ventilation, upper entrance. We need to explore that somewhat more. And then, of course, you should always be prepared to feed in the late spring if you need to. This is a picture not from last winter, but a few winters ago, another cold winter. Okay, any questions?
You said about feeding the pollen sub.
Yeah.
So I'm buying it in 50-pound bags.
Okay,
I got a bunch of hives up here, and but I never seem to use it all. Does it go bad? I mean, I'm keeping it dry.
good, good. Yeah.
Does it go bad?
What we really need to do is, I wish I was still in the research lab. Somebody needs to take a sample of that, and the most labile amino acid is tryptophan. And so we really need to find out how quickly that tryptophan degrades. Now, in a dry powder, it should be pretty stable. So I think that's the key, is to make sure you keep, as they say in the old Westerns, keep your powder dry. Yeah. So I can't really answer your question, but I think if it's dry, it should be good.
Okay, thank you. Another comment was, and I'm obviously, you know, I'm an upper box. I don't use upper entrances at all.
Oh,
I
good.
find, over winter, as long as I have that insulation on the top, like you said, I find the moisture doesn't bother them as long as it stays warm.
Great.
It gets
Yeah,
cold,
what,
the problem.
yeah. Yeah, Mike, what I've actually read is that when you have that insulation on top, the warm, moist air comes up, doesn't condense on the inner cover like it would if you had no insulation there. It goes over and condenses on the exterior walls. And I forget who said it, but somebody was indicating that the bees may actually
Lick it up.
go over there on warm days and recapture that water, because of course they need to drink water all the time, just like we do. So yeah, I think that top insulation is very valuable, and I'm glad to hear that you don't use an upper entrance. Thank you for that. Anybody else awake?
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Is
you're
there,
welcome.
you mentioned goldenrod and there being about 100 different kinds, but not all of them are very useful. Do you know any way that we can tell if we've got one that's useful? I mean, I've seen
No,
on one kind going crazy on it and another kind they don't even visit. So
yeah, so I've talked to, and Jeff may be able to answer this better than I. When I was inspector, I had an even bigger territory than Jeff has now. So I went all the way up to the New York State border, and I forget what they told me, but they, up there, Wayne County, et cetera, were looking for a particular variety based on its flower shape. But I forget whether they like the pointed or the flat one. I forget. It's been a few years.
I mean, can you, if you see a stand of goldenrod and there's bees all over it in the fall,
Yeah.
can you trust that is that the good one? I mean,
Well, not necessarily, because when they're desperate, they go for anything, like that cracked corn. It's probably better, much better than cracked corn for sure. But somebody needs to do those studies, and I don't know, maybe we can talk to Christina Grosinger or somebody at Penn State to do some studies on that for us, because that's valuable information, because we really depend on those fall plants for the nutrition for our bees. And I was just shocked that I have access to the library at Delaware Valley University, and I couldn't find any information about amino acid content of the pollen from goldenrod. I figured I'd find a bunch of papers, but I came up empty-handed. Maybe I wasn't searching the right way, but yeah.
I've heard beekeepers argue about the color of goldenrod honey, whether it's light, whether it's dark. Do you happen to have any insight there? Do you think that could be related to the type of goldenrod?
Oh, that's an interesting point, Jeff. Yeah, because my sister lives up in New York State, and they make goldenrod honey there. It's not super light, but it's not dark. It's a kind of intermediate color. I love the taste of it, so that's what I think of as goldenrod honey. So I haven't seen very light, and it may be the type of goldenrod that she has up there in she's northeast, a little northeast of Albany, New York. So it could be that that's the type of goldenrod that they have up in her area.
I'm sort of still kind of curious about the timing of feeding. I mean, you're saying we could feed one-to-ones in August and September. Feed.
And maybe even into October,
Okay.
Beekeeping doesn't go by the calendar, right? It has to go by the environment.
Yeah.
But yeah, so my goal is to keep the population from dropping. If there's natural nectar and pollen coming in, no need to feed. Right? You don't want to waste your time and money. It's when it looks like there's nothing coming in. And one of the ways you can tell flow on, if you take a frame of open honey and set it up against the hive, the bees are essentially going to ignore it. If there's no honey coming in and you do that same thing, you can easily set off robbing. So that kind of tells you that they're not collecting a whole lot when you have to be very careful about robbing. And I think for my particular location right now, yeah, robbing can happen easy if I'm not careful to keep everything covered when I take a hive apart.
Wow. Yeah, I'm not sure I'd want to try that experiment, putting out an open frame.
Yeah, it's during the honey flow, bees got too much to worry about. But when there's not much coming in, they're ready to steal anybody's honey. Jeff, have you seen any robbing?
Nothing crazy yet.
Okay. Yeah.
Let's see.
Thank you, Vince.
Oh, you're most welcome. You related to Julia?
He doesn't have an S, and I do.
I see. Okay.
Surgeon named Gardner Child as well.
Okay.
A relation.
Oh, there is a question in the chat box from Vin. I don't know if he wanted to ask this as well, but it says, should we treat for mites before winter, even if the count is low? I mean, how do you?
I mean, and Jeff, is Jeff's opinion, if the mite counts are low, why bother treating? I mean, in fact, I'd be happy if I had colonies that kept their mites low all the way up to So fall, I didn't need to treat. I think those are the bees that we're really looking for, but they're rare things indeed.
They are rare. I think just to say the other side of it, if it's June or July and you have a couple, maybe 2 mites in your alcohol wash, that's early enough in the season that you are likely going to need to treat in the next month or so, and temperatures could be hot depending on what product you want to use. So in that scenario, you might be better off to treat low threshold with a product that you can do with the right temperature window while you have it, and then maybe buy yourself time to do a fall treatment after you can get your honey supers off or something like that. It's all about buying yourself time.
Exactly. And what's her name? Katie Lee in Marla Spivak's lab has done some research on that, and I don't think she's published the paper yet. She talked about it at one of the last national beekeepers meetings that we had. Maybe she's published it, I just haven't looked for it. But yeah, she was talking about treating in early, so their seasons are later than ours. So, she was talking about treating in June up there to keep mites low in September. So yeah, Jeff, that's a good idea. Yeah. And especially if you're going to use formic acid, it can get too hot and then you're in trouble. Yeah.
Yeah. You don't want to be in the position where you're waiting for it to cool off to do your primary treatment and mites are way out of control and hive starts crashing.
Yep.
I think this is not totally fair to say, but a lot of people that have trouble with formic, they have a high mite load and like not necessarily parasitic mite syndrome, but kind of maybe the precursor to that. And then they put the queens are stressed, everything, and they can lose a queen, they can lose a lot of brood, they can not have a whole lot of colony left after treatment if it goes bad. And it's so I don't.
Yeah, I agree.
And most people I've heard say that you should treat the whole apiary, even if just one hive is high. You should treat the whole apiary as a superorganism.
Yeah, I'd like to hear Jeff's opinion on that, but I would like to find colonies that can keep their mites low, and we do know that there's robbing and drifting and all this stuff, so mites can certainly spread from colony to colony. But usually I do an individual thing. If I find a colony that's high, luckily this year I haven't found any that are super high. But if I find a colony that's high, I treat, and if its neighbor is very low, I wait a month and then see if they're still low and then treat the next month. So it's not the best. I agree that getting them all at once is probably going to reduce the spread, but I'd like to find bees that are taking care of the mites themselves. I know it's a dream, but I'm always looking.
That's a good point. I'm tempted to say that the default should be to treat the yard. And then if you're going to do alcohol washes on every single colony, then you can say this one doesn't need treatment and that one doesn't need treatment. But if a lot of people just kind of don't treat and then they get themselves in trouble. Yeah.
Treating is better than not treating if exactly.
But it's a lot of work, and I feel like there's a lot of interest and it's good and like breeding a better bee, but it's a lot of work to actually collect the data to make progress there, and nobody wants to do the work. And so I'd rather have a hive treated and not know that it's mite resistant than not treated and maybe it's mite
and it dies. Yep.
There's just so many factors that go into everything, whether the colony was split or whether it swarmed or You know, without-
Yes, absolutely. Splitting and swarming are great mite controls. I mean, I see that in my nukes because I split my nukes 2 or 3 times over the course of the season, and usually the mite loads are very low without any additional treatment.
Can I ask, when you split your nukes, do you add a queen or do you let them raise their own?
No, I either add a mated queen or I add a queen cell. I'm a firm believer that you need a strong population of nurse bees to raise the best queen. So usually a nuke is not, in my opinion, not strong enough to raise their own queen, or you know, they'll raise a queen, but will they raise a high quality queen? I think that's the question. So I usually designate strong production colonies to be the cell builder for me when I raise queen cells.
I would agree with that, but have you heard, I think Sam Comfort was involved with some research about like emergency cell, like little, I believe it was mating nukes raising their own queen, and they on the study about queen quality, and they didn't really find a difference. It was the way I remember it, but maybe I'm wrong.
Did you know if that was published, Jeff?
I don't really know. I forget exactly where I heard that from, but I'm curious. You know, I agree with you that you want a big, strong colony that's well fed to raise your queens. But if, you know, it's just interesting that according to one study that maybe it doesn't make a difference, but that's probably not totally accurate. But it's all about quality, you know, strong colonies. And if the mating groups are packed, maybe they can do a good job.
Yeah.
They
And
say
it's strong relative to the number of cells that you're trying to raise. So yeah, I mean, you can take a nuke and use it as a cell builder if you're just doing a few cells. Yeah, strong nuke. Yeah. Okay, our population seems to be dwindling. We're down to 14.
Yeah,
we-
sorry. Yeah, it looks like a number of people have signed up. Well, I wanted to certainly thank you very, very, very much for giving us a lot of this information. It's really important.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's been very helpful to me. And one last note, I did put once again the links in the chat box if you want to volunteer at Honeyfest. But golly, do we have any last questions from anybody at all? I guess we could sign up. Oh, I did want to ask, would it be okay to put this recording on YouTube? I mean, we could save it and put it on if it's okay with you.
Yeah, it's okay with me.
Okay, so I can save it and make sure anybody who wants to go back and refer to what we were talking about. I still have to be, digesting everything that you said and going up and feeding the bees. So, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
I do have one question. I'm very sorry about earlier. I had to do this on my cell phone. I thought I could do it on my computer, but it's a tad bit off, maybe question, but is there any validity to actually moving your bees to one side of the super so they learn to go to one side during feeding during wintertime?
I prefer to have my bees in the center because I've had colonies starve. If they get off to one side, they eat all the honey on that side. And then if it's cold, they can't go back to the other side where the honey is. And so they can starve with honey, right there in the hive, but they just can't get to it. Jeff, what's your opinion?
I have 4 things that I shoot for winter. I want a young queen, or at least not a really old queen. I want low mites before September and the rest of the fall. I want bees wall to wall. And I feel like that's a huge concept that a lot of new beekeepers don't grasp. I want bees from one side to another in as few boxes as possible.
Mhm.
And then I want that cavity filled with feed,
Yeah.
whether it's syrup or the fall flow. I think that wall to wall compressed, I want to compress the bees into as few boxes as possible and then just feed them up real good. And if you hit those 4 marks, you will most likely have bees in the spring. I think
Yeah,
that's
good.
it's good. So I'm not totally sure who that was, but the bees all pressed to one side. I agree with Vince that they can starve out there, and depending on what side it is, they might prefer the other one that gets morning sun, or what, the bees will kind of orient themselves the way they want to be. I'm not sure you said about feeding, so you were going to put sugar right on top of them, or what was the thinking there?
Well, I've done well with bees, and I've actually stacked my hives with full supers. I'm talking deeps now, and I've done 2 deeps. We're trying to take larger colonies of bees that we seem to produce here and get them down to maybe a single deep or a double deep without having to put a medium super on top. My problem is that most of the times when we're doing this, we're doing the medium supers. We're trying to keep an eye on them. We sit there and we put a not so much a fondant on top, it's more of a bee candy on top, and we end up with the bees end up laying into the mediums, which are trying to get away from that if we could.
Yeah.
But they start doing that very, say, early in the late winter, February, March or so.
Last year or every year, they seem to not cap honey for me, so I harvest what I can, and I always have a couple supers that I just never get around to harvesting. So I take them, and I also try to keep brood out of my honey supers. I think that's probably good practice.
I'm sorry.
I take the medium and I put that directly on the bottom board, and then I'll put the deeps on top of it. And then if it's uncapped, a lot of times they'll just pull the nectar right out of the medium, and if so, I can just pull it off. If not, then I can leave it all winter, and on a warm winter day, they can go down, suck up as much honey as they want, and take it up and store it where they need it. So maybe that's somewhat helpful. I mean, a lot of people do a deep and a medium. A lot of people don't think about keeping brood out of their supers, so on some level, it doesn't really matter. You just, in the spring, make sure the queen's below, and put an excluder on. And that might actually be a good way to get them working in the supers. Whenever I put brood above an excluder or separate it, I'll check it in a week just to make sure they don't raise queen cells on it.
All right, thank you very much. I'm sorry, I had a damn train come by.
Yeah.
So I appreciate all your input. I enjoyed listening to the video this evening. And thank you very much.
Oh, perfectly welcome. Anyway, well, okay. I guess since it's 8 after 9, I guess we'll wrap it up. And thank you, Vince. No. I'm going to wait for everybody to sign off. Bye, Kirk. Bye, Jim.
Bye.
Bye, Justin. I'm going to cut it off. Thanks.